Rachel is one of the co-founders of the Perch CMS and one of the co-founders of edgeofmyseat.com, which is an organization behind it. You work with Drew McClellan as well, right? Is he your husband? I learn a new thing every day. He's one of my favorite people. Rachel's going to talk about some of the changes that have happened over in recent years and where the balance is and where the balance lies between contribution and confidence. So, big round of applause, please.
Hello. So I'm Rachel Andrew. I am a Brit. As you can probably hear, I'm a CSS Working Group Inviced expert, Google Developer expert, and one half of a very tiny little company. We have a PHP and MySQL product called Perch. And I've been working as a web developer since '96. So the most frequently asked questions to me, really, on sort of podcasts and things is, what would I advise someone if they were getting started as a web developer? And I have no idea what to say to that because things have changed so much from when I started doing this. So I'm going to take you back to even before then. I'll take you back to 1989, where some of you probably weren't even born. And I looked like this. That's a costume, by the way. I didn't sort of live in Downton Abbey or anything. And computers looked like this. That's an Amstrad CPC 464. That's what we had at home. It's got a tape drive. Games took about 20 minutes to load. And two men showed up in my classroom at school for a careers talk, and they declared that everyone in the future would need to use computers in their job. And I put my hand up, "Sir, I'm going to be a dancer." And they conceded that perhaps dancers wouldn't need to know how to use computers, which was fortunate, because my father, a computer programmer, had tried to teach me BASIC at one point and given up in frustration, saying this child will never be any good with computers. So I left school at 16 and I did study dance. Eventually I moved into backstage work, and I was working in the West End of London backstage when I became pregnant with my daughter. This was '96. All I knew was the theatre. I had no qualifications. I had no other experience. And working backstage isn't something you can really do with a baby. So I ended up with a computer due to a man in PC World selling me a computer rather than the word processor that I wanted. I'm old enough to have learned to type at school, and I thought I'd take in typing as something to do while I had this baby. I ended up with a computer. It was a Packard Bell. It had a 640 by 480 screen, and I could either have the sound card working or the modem. I chose the modem. So I ended up with an internet connection. The ISP was run by two guys down the road in kind of a shed, and every time I had trouble with Trumpet Windsock, I'd ring them up, and one of them would help me day or night. And I was 21 at the time, and I knew nothing about babies. And so when the net connection was working, I started searching the web. And I found this online community, an American community called Parents' Place, where mums were chatting. And so I joined in. And that was kind of my first introduction to the web, somewhere where a lonely and frightened young woman was able to find community and advice from people, on the other side of the world. And the thing about the web back then is it was all kind of do-it-yourself. There was no Facebook, there was no Flickr. If you wanted to share some photos or some thoughts about being a parent, you'd have to build yourself a website. And so Parents' Place was full of forums. Some of them were about housekeeping and looking after babies and being up all night with babies, and others were about learning HTML, because we were all teaching each other HTML so we could put websites up and show off our baby photos. And people who knew Photoshop were sort of creating these border sets along with the HTML to put it on your page. Do not edit this bit. And so we would put these things up. And so I learned HTML and I built myself a website. And then a really strange thing happened, and a life-changing thing happened. I was suddenly the person who knew HTML. I had this skill, I had this ability to publish to a new medium. And someone paid me to build them a website. And then somebody else paid me to build them a website, and well, this was better than typing. And I was learning how to do quite a lot of stuff by this point. I'd taught myself some basic JavaScript, and I was teaching myself Perl, and I was teaching myself Linux, because I wanted to be able to have something to run Perl on. Red Hat 5.2 was my very first Linux install. And so as I was doing this, I was kind of starting to contribute a bit on the forums and on the boards. I was going into the Parents' Place forums and helping out people with their HTML, and then I was starting to move out into web design forums. And I figured that because I was asking so many questions and making a real nuisance of myself, I ought to try and give back in some way. And I could see there were newbies coming in all the time and were asking the same questions I'd asked the day before, so I would answer them. And that was just how this worked. It was a fledgling industry of people figuring stuff out with the help of people who'd figured it out yesterday. And in turn, they were helping someone who was a couple of days behind. By early 2000, I was a single mum. My marriage to my daughter's father broke up, and I needed to get more than the odd bits of freelance work that I had been doing. And I managed to blag my way into a .com job, heading up a technical team with my scraped-together HTML skills, with my knowledge of Linux built up by trying to install Linux on terrible old Office surplus supply machines while I was learning Perl. I had a new job. The web, that was something that hadn't existed when I was at school, had given me this career. And it did that by being accessible and by having this amazing culture of sharing what we know. So I talk a lot about CSS, and I actually pretty much predate CSS. When I started, web design was all font tags and nested tables. I fairly quickly jumped on that CSS bandwagon, though, because it seemed to make sense having all your CSS, all your font styling in one place, and then just linking that to your pages. That kind of worked. And by 2000, we were already talking about using CSS instead of tables for layout. But it was really hard. Our reference points were a few sites. This is Glish.com and the Noodle Instant box lessons. These pieces of our history are still online. And again, this was just a few people who'd already worked out that this was actually possible and were passing it on to those of us who thought this might be a good idea and wanted to try it out. And in turn, by this point, I was quite involved with the Dreamweaver community. And so I was building examples that worked in Dreamweaver and showing it to people there. And as the kind of .com meltdown happened, I decided actually doing freelance work was probably a bit safer. So by September 2001, I'd launched my own business as a developer. And this is our first website, the CSS Layout. IE6 had just been released. And we love to complain, or anyone who sort of has lived through the time of IE6 kind of hanging around, we love to complain about IE6. But for those of us who just lived through the browser wars, it was a wonderful, wonderful browser. This was the page on the Web Standards Project site that people were redirected to or saw a message linking to if they were using a version 4 browser. It says IE6 for Windows delivers fine support for HTML4, CSS1, and other important W3C standards. That browser upgrade campaign encouraged an upgrade to IE6 because it enabled us to move the web forward. And it kind of marked a change in the direction of the Web Standards Project, because before that, they'd been working really with browser vendors. Now they were working with web developers themselves. And it was in 2001 that I was actually invited to become part of WASP. And I was invited to do that because of the work I've been doing in the Dreamweaver community. And so I was working with Macromedia on behalf of WASP as part of the Dreamweaver task force, trying to encourage standards in the authoring tool. So my contributions in terms of writing about web standards and encouraging people in the Dreamweaver community gave me this opportunity to be part of the Web Standards Project. And suddenly there I was working with people like Jeffrey Zeldman, who I'd kind of admired from afar for all the time I'd been building web pages. So while IE6 made CSS for layout actually possible for the mainstream, it certainly wasn't perfect, as we all know. And I think as developers, we increasingly became kind of browser bugs experts. The IE team were kind of done, over 90% of people using IE, and the sites we developed were becoming more and more complex, and it was really becoming harder and harder to develop and dealing with this legacy browser. What took experience was knowing which combination of things would cause half of your content to go missing in IE6. That was really our sort of main job. In this short talk, I can't give a full sort of story of how we escaped the IE6 monoculture, but thankfully we did, and we have a good range of browsers these days that things work in. And by 2013, the WASP actually closed their doors. And this quote is from the Goodbye post on the WASP blog. So what does this actually mean for the modern web? What it means is that standard things are pretty much implemented in standard ways by our browsers. We don't need to build 2 sites or fork our code to get around issues. That doesn't mean that every browser is identical and all support all the new features at the same time. That's never going to happen. But detecting lack of a feature is an awful lot easier than dealing with buggy features. It means that innovation happens through the standards process, which is what we asked for. So many of our most exciting new specs, they've come from a browser vendor proposal. So if you come to my talk in an hour or so, I'll be introducing you to CSS Grid Layout. That spec was developed by Microsoft and first implemented experimentally in IE 10. The grid spec's now at candidate recommendation status, which is a time for implementation experience to be gathered. So for the spec to progress, we're going to need at least 2 implementations in browsers for it to become a W3C recommendation. That's how things work. So a spec might be proposed by a certain browser vendor or somebody else. Adobe have proposed some specs. But it's going to need to have 2 interoperable implementations before it can become what we term a web standard, so a W3C recommendation. And because of this focus on interoperability, the sort of show-stopping bugs we saw back in the Netscape 4 or IE6 days are pretty rare. So the industry's kind of grown up. We don't need to spend all of our time figuring out browser bugs anymore, so what do? Well, I think we develop JavaScript frameworks, don't we? And I think, to some extent, the sudden proliferation of tools and processes and frameworks, they're kind of this industry growing up. We're saying, well, hang on, we're doing front-end web development, but we're engineers too. We can use OOCSS, we're going to use JavaScript, and we're going to call ourselves JavaScript engineers. We're going to create frameworks and tooling and preprocessors. And I'm not in any way anti-tooling. I think this stuff is incredibly useful. It solves real problems. We use a lot of this stuff day to day. But we are creating a lot of complexity. And we're also taking a step back from the real languages of the web, these simple languages of the web that enabled someone like me, someone who believed she was no good with computers, to start building for the web. And I see these beginner-level tutorials that require the installation of this huge tool chain before the person gets to write any code. And do we really need this? And it worries me because it was that simplicity of the web that enabled me to participate in the first place. And that simplicity actually hasn't gone away. It's still possible to do great work on a very, very simple stack. Ultimately, everything that we do outputs HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. How we get to that point is just process. And a focus on tools and frameworks as being the most important thing, and whether that's front or back end, it inevitably results in people learning the tool rather than the core skills. And this is a shame. Because there's something that comes out of knowing your core skills well. It gives you an opportunity to contribute. And I wouldn't be standing here had it not been for the many, many people who shared their knowledge with me over the years. That started with the mums in Parents' Place who explained to me what HTML was. It was the people on Usenet who helped me when I was learning Perl, sometimes slightly angrily, but they did help. And I learned a lot about dealing with people who maybe weren't overly pleased to have me in their community through that. And also the many of my peers who write and speak today, and I rely on their work to let me know about new techniques and to help me inform myself on all the things that I can't possibly be an expert on across the stack today. With a confidence in what you know, and with a confidence in those core skills, you can then use that knowledge to help other people. And that's even if you're sitting here and you're a new developer. Even if you've only been doing this for a year, there will be someone 6 months in who you can help. And in fact, you'll probably be better at it than I will. Because getting started now, as I say, it's so different from when I got started. It's hard for me to remember what it's like, to look at HTML for the first time and think, what on earth is this? And any language, it's the same as you go along. It's much, much harder for you to help someone out. And the thing is that every time I write a tutorial, every time I put together a technical conference talk, I learn something about the subject. There's something about teaching other people that helps you identify and clarify and fill in the gaps in your own knowledge. You will learn as you teach. And I see this happening with new people over and over again as they enter the industry. They start teaching people the things that they're learning. Their profile grows. And then all of a sudden, they're everywhere. They're getting speaking slots. They're writing articles. They're on Smashing Magazine. They're on stage at conferences. They're writing a book. And you're like, where did they come from? And you look back, and it started with them teaching people. They were writing on their own blog. They were helping out in forums. And I talked about my involvement with WASP, the Web Standards Project. And that was so key to me progressing in my own career. The sharing of what I'd learned is essentially how I ended up being part of that. And I'm still sharing what I know. This is my Site of CSS Grid examples, which really was behind me becoming an invited expert to the CSS Working Group, and mainly due to that work on grid and layout that I got asked to come along there. And CSS Working Group meetings mostly consist of representatives from browser vendors, which is great. It helps this interoperability I've already talked about. But what's missing from those meetings is the voice of what we call authors. And authors is the term the working groups use for people who write HTML and CSS, so people who build websites. And we have these working group meetings, and all of the time it'll come up, what do authors think? Well, we can't get all the authors in the room. We can't get all the web developers to contribute to a CSS working group meeting. That would be chaotic. But actually, we don't need to, because we should just be able to search the web, and we'll find out what authors think. But that relies on authors actually writing about this stuff and writing about new and experimental things at a point at which we can make a difference to the spec. And you'd be very, very surprised how few things it takes online for the working group to say, oh, well, people want to be able to do this. Or for browser vendors to say, hey, we need to implement this spec. People want to see this in browsers. I think there's this kind of old-fashioned understanding about how the standards process works, and a lot of it comes from that past where there was sort of this adversarial thing going on between browser vendors. And so it's worth just figuring out how the standards process works. And this is a really great post from spec writer Fantasy, explaining how a specification moves through the process to become a W3C recommendation, and also explaining where different standards have come from, whether that be a browser vendor or something that's actually invented by the working group to fill a need that we see. But what you discover is that there's no point complaining about CSS or any other spec once it's finished. You have to make your case during the standards process. Because people look at completed specs and say, well, this is useless. Why does this do this? This doesn't work for us. But it's very, very hard to change something that's in browsers and actually out there on the web. If you've done any front-end development, you're probably aware of some properties being prefixed with a vendor prefix. That's a legitimate way for browser vendors to extend CSS. It's also been used to expose experimental CSS to authors. The problem with that was that authors then used the experimental CSS in production. And this has led to all kinds of problems, such as browser vendors having to implement other browsers' vendor prefixes, and we're seeing experimental specifications changing and people complaining that such and such a browser broke their CSS. And so what's happened now is that most new features are going to be developed behind experimental flags in browsers, which raises a different problem. Because if things are behind a feature flag that developers have to go and toggle to play around with the specification, they don't. CSS Grid Layout has been behind experimental flags since, I think, early 2013. I've been writing about it and speaking about it since then. It's really taken until this year to get other developers to take an interest in it. And there's been a huge amount of code in browsers for a very long time. I would show people it at conferences, they'd have a look, they'd say, yeah, that's very nice, I'll have a look when it's actually usable by my clients. And so in the past, people would play with experimental CSS because it was prefixed. Now, they're not going to look at it unless you actually have to go out there and be proactive and start playing around with this stuff. Because that's our time. That's our time as developers to have a look, play with this stuff, and feed back to browser vendors and to the CSS working group and say whether it's working for us. Earlier in the presentation, I showed you some websites from the past, and these things still all work in our modern browsers. This is the amazing thing about CSS. 20-year-old CSS still works. It doesn't all break. Those sites all still work perfectly well. So think about that the next time you're wondering why CSS is so weird. And behold, the list of things the CSS working group are going to change once we've invented a time machine. These are all things we can't change now because they break chunks of the web. So we can change this, we can stop this kind of happening in future by catching things while they're experimental. Browser vendors and spec writers aren't trying to do things we hate, but they're filtering our needs. So the more we can explain what we need, the more likely it is we'll get what we want. So if anything that you ever do touches the front end, it's so helpful if you can engage with that process and contribute to it. It's a case of helping future developing you out. And you can contribute via GitHub. The CSS specs are all on GitHub, so you can find the specification you're interested in and raise an issue, just like any other open source project. So here's one such discussion happening, so you can search for existing issues and add your thoughts as a comment. Please do that. Please also contribute to interoperability, raise bugs with browsers. And really the kind of killer thing for this is make sure you know how to create a reduced test case. Make sure other people that you work with know how to create a reduced test case so you can log bugs with browsers. It's probably the best skill that will save time in your own work and also allows you to log issues in any project, not just browsers. And so I'm back to learning, because really that's what it's all been about for me. Learning, sharing, and growing confidence in the skills I have by being able to pass them on to others. And it's the reason I'm still here, and it's the reason I'm still as excited about this industry after 20 years, still able to learn, still able to contribute, and that's really what I would hope for any of you here listening today. Thank you very much.